special joint budget and finance and city council meeting. We have a representative from SCHLENNER, Winter and Company on the line who's going to walk us through the audit for last fiscal year 2019. Go ahead.
Ryan, anytime.
Okay. A little bit of trouble hearing, so you'll have to communicate for me, Belinda.
Okay.
Okay. Well, for starters, I just wanted to thank you all for allowing me to kind of do this in this format.
Everybody here?
You know, as part of our jobs, we do so much travel. We've really been trying to mitigate that as much as possible as a firm policy. So thank you for that, and it certainly made for an interesting last month or so. But anyway, my name's Ryan Schmidt. I'm a senior manager with SCHLENNER, Winter and Company, and I'm going to be walking us through the results of your 2019 audit. So, flipping into the first slide here, well, I should say we're mailing hard copies of the full audited financial statements, and I've already sent PDFs to Belinda, which she likely distributed to you already. But this here that we're walking through today is basically a summarized version of the high points of the financial statements and the overall result of the audit. Okay, so for starters, what is an audit? You know, what do we do from a really high level when we come out each year? So basically, this little slide here basically summarizes from a real high level what an audit consists of. So we come in, we obtain your financial records, your financial data from throughout the year, perform various procedures such as inquiries, analytics, where we develop expectations and compare results to those expectations. And then we do things like sampling and lots of detailed testing. And the purpose of all of this is for us to be able to formulate an opinion on whether or not we feel that your financial statements are materially accurate. So we don't take a 100% pervasive look at every transaction and everything that happens during the year. We take a risk-based approach using these procedures to express an opinion. And the opinion you got this year is the same one that we've rendered in the past, which is an unmodified or a clean opinion. So that's the best opinion you can hope for. Some other results from the audit here, basically just some housekeeping items. You know, how did the audit go? The audit went really smoothly. You know, Belinda and the whole finance team do a great job preparing for the audit. They're very responsive and make things go really well for us. You know, we didn't come across anything unusual as far as strange accounting transactions or weird accounting treatments or anything along those lines that really required further investigation. And then the last item here, there were a couple estimates in the financial statements, same as in the past, which we consider to be significant estimates just because of the number of inputs that go into them. So those would be the net pension liability and then the calculation of the net OPEB liability. Both of these balances, both of these liabilities are calculated by actuarial studies, and there's just so many different inputs that go into these studies, and when those inputs fluctuate, your liabilities fluctuate, and you either recognize more expense or less expense, and it can really kind of throw your financial statements off a bit. We always like to point that out. But we'll look at the impact of that on a few slides later. All right, so as part of the audit, we're not only looking at your numbers and verifying your numbers, there's a few other things that we have to do as well. One of those things is looking at the controls that you have in place that help you get to those numbers. So the first one that we have here, we've got 3 findings this year. They're the same that we've had in the past, extremely common findings. And the first one we have here is related to audit adjustments. So basically what this is saying is that as part of the audit, as we're performing our procedures, if we see adjustments that need to be made in order to get you to that clean opinion, we help you with making those adjustments. And because we help with those adjustments, we have to let the readers know that by having this finding recorded here. Now, I will say that for a city your size, the number of adjustments that we post during the audit is actually quite a bit less than what we post on most of our cities. So, I mean, the numbers we get for the audit are actually really clean when we get them. And the preparations that go into the audit are really solid. It's just that there's a few adjustments we always assist with each year that are just a little bit over that threshold where we still need to have this finding. The next item we have here relates to lack of segregation of duties. This is easily the most pervasive and common finding that we report on all of our cities. We maybe have one or two that don't have this finding, but it's very common. Basically what this is saying is that because of the number of staff that you have in place, the size of your city, it's really difficult, if not possible, to fully segregate all of your accounting functions to the extent that would be considered ideal. And as a result of this, there's some heightened risk that errors or other activities might go undetected. So the best thing you can do is be aware of this, constantly review the processes and procedures you have in place, and really try to implement any oversight or any compensating controls that you can whenever there's an area that you see as maybe having a little weaker controls than maybe other areas. And the last item we have here relates to financial statement preparation. This is just letting the readers know that we as a third party, we do prepare your financial statements on behalf. All right, next slide here, before we get into the numbers. As part of the audit, we always have to look at your compliance with various Minnesota statutes. So the state actually gives us checklists for each one of these areas, telling us specifically what statute they should be complied with. And we do have two findings this year, which are listed at the bottom here. The first one relates to those fire state aid dollars that come in from the state to the city, and then the city turns around and pays them out to the Fire Relief Association. Now that turnaround needs to happen within 30 days of receiving the funds from the state. I think this year it happened within like 45 or 50 days or something along those lines. So because you were outside that 30-day window, we did need to put it on here. The other item we have here is really just a timing issue. At the end of the year, the bank always does a review of your deposits, and they see how they look at your cash balances and they compare it to your FDIC coverage, and they see how much collateral they have to assign so that your deposits are fully secured by either FDIC or collateral. Well, it sounds like the bank did that review as of the morning of December 31st, and then you had numerous deposits on December 31st, and as a result, it pushed your balance up to a point where it was no longer being collateralized fully. And as a result, we needed to have this finding in here for you having, for the city having some cash that was exposed to some credit risk. But it was quickly mitigated after year end, or remedied after year end, I should say. Okay, with that, we'll get into the numbers a little bit. First, we've got the general fund here. Each one of these, we're going to do a bit of a trend analysis, look at 2015 through 2019, and then on a few of these slides, we also compare to the budget. So revenues in the blue, expenditures in the red, and your fund balance, that static balance at the end of the year, is the green bar. Then, of course, your budget is the stripes. So looking big picture, budget to actual, what happened during the year. Your revenues came in at about $2,087,000, which was about $139,000 over what you had budgeted for the year. Expenditures in the general fund came in at about $1.9 million, which was about $185,000 over what you had budgeted for the year. And those differences, the details of those, we'll look into those in a couple future slides here we've got coming up. The biggest thing that kind of changed here compared to the prior year was actually this other sources category. And this is actually just your transfers out to other funds. You had some pretty significant transfers out this year to capital project funds for street and sidewalk improvements, park improvements, etc., which were in line with your budget. But as a result of that, you had a decrease in your fund balance of about $224,000 compared to a budgeted decrease in your fund balance of about $190,000. So you ended the year with a fund balance of about $1.7 million. The next slide here, we look at that fund balance and we turn it into a ratio. So you have a policy in place for your fund balance to have a target fund balance equal to approximately 55 to 60% of the following year's budgeted operating expenditures. The ratio that we have going up here is that unassigned fund balance as a percentage of your annual budgeted expenditures. So with that decrease in fund balance that we saw on the previous page, this ratio of course dropped off a little bit, although not quite as much as you maybe would have expected. And that's because the other side of this ratio, the expenditures, the budgeted expenses, those actually decreased as well. So fund balance decreased, the budget decreased, and as a result, you only dropped off by about 1%. So last year, this ratio was at about 91%. This year, 89.5. Okay, so as promised, here's a little bit more detail on your revenues, and then the next slide is going to have a little more detail on the expenditures. Just 2018, 2019, and then the 2019 budget on this slide. I'm not going to walk through every single category here. You kind of get the picture, but I'm going to look at some of the bigger differences that stood out to me. So the first one that stood out to me was this investment income category. You had actual investment earnings in your general fund of about $30,000 higher than what you budgeted. This is to be your investments performing better. Miscellaneous revenues came in about $47,000 higher than budgeted. This was mostly because you had a refund or a payment from the state of Minnesota related to your MNLARS program that you spent a significant amount of time on. So I think that accounted for most of that additional revenue. And then the one other item that stuck out to me here compared to the budget was your intergovernmental revenues. They came in about $50,000 higher than budgeted, which there's a few different things that went into this, various grants and state aids. But the larger one was that you had, I think it was about $35,000 more than budgeted from your Toward Zero Death funding that flows through the city of St. Cloud each year. So that came in a fair amount over budget. The next slide, similar layout, but looking at your expenditures in a bit more detail here. General government expenditures came in over budget, about $58,000. Things that are included here, administration, council-related expenditures, various miscellaneous professional services included here once in a while. And it was actually those professional services and those administration expenses that accounted for that additional expense budget. Public safety is where you had the largest difference between budget and actual. You actually had about $82,000 more of expenditures than you had budgeted. That's mostly related to police and fire compensation. And public works came in about $43,000 over budget. Various street maintenance type projects that pushed you over in that category. And just real quick, this is your cash over the past 5 years in your general fund. Pretty flat, a little bit of a drop off this year. Okay, so that's it for the general fund. The rest of the funds here we'll go through a little bit quicker. Here we've got your debt service fund and your capital projects fund combined in one slide here. Debt service fund activity here is pretty much what you would expect. You've got your property taxes, your special assessments coming in, that's revenues. Then you've got your expenditures going out, that's your debt service payments. Everything in that fund, in that category is pretty much set what you would expect it to be. Capital project fund. Here you had a bit more volatile activity this year. You can see your expenditures were quite a bit more than your revenues, but you did have these other sources as well. So expenditures, this is primarily, I think about 3.4 million of this was for your 2019 street improvement projects. And then your other sources, this is actually primarily bond proceeds, as well as transfers in from other funds like the general fund. But you had bond proceeds in here of about $4.2 million. So that's what was funding these expenditures. So overall, you had an increase in your capital project funds of about $970,000. Ended the year with a fund balance of about $2.1 million. And similar to what the graph we had for the general fund, we have a graph here for the cash in your debt service and your capital project funds as well. Debt service, a little bit of a climb here again this year. Capital projects shot up quite a bit, and that's because you had proceeds from that debt that you issued, and it hasn't been fully spent in the project yet, so you've still got cash on hand at the end of the year. So I would expect that to then drop off in 2020. All right, moving into your proprietary funds. The first one we'll look at here is your water fund. So blue here, we've got your operating revenues. Red, your operating expenses. So typically you want to see the blue bar, or the blue line here above your red, showing that you have some operating income. And then the purple here, this is your change in net position. So not your net position, but your change in net position each year. So whenever this blue, or whenever this purple line is above zero, you know you had a positive increase in net position that year. So looking at current year activities, kind of comparing 2019 to 2018, operating revenues came in really close to last year. That was pretty flat. Operating expenses, on the other hand, you did have a bit of an increase there, about $63,000 increase. Most of that was related to repairs and maintenance, professional services, things like that. It was a little bit spread across the board, but various expenses for items of those nature. So overall, you had operating income this year of about $7,600. Your non-operating activity down here below, a little bit of a return to normalcy actually. In the previous years, you had capital contributions from other funds as you wrap up projects, and then that portion of the infrastructure gets capitalized. You've had various transfers, things like that. This year, this is basically just investment income, this $96,000. And this $65,000, this is your payments for debt interest and transfers to other funds to help finance some water-related debt in those funds. So a little bit of a return to normalcy down here. Overall, you had an increase in your net position of about $38,000. All right, next fund here we have is your sewer fund. First thing that strikes me on this fund is that past 2 years you've had that positive operating income. Last year you had operating income in this fund of about $76,000. 2019 operating income about $45,000. Both your revenues and your expenses jumped up a bit here. The biggest change comparing 2018 to 2019 is down in your non-operating revenues. This big spike that you see here is due to that grant that you received for the AMPI project. There we go. So that increase there is due to the AMPI project grant funding that you received. And as a result, that's what's accounting for the majority of your increase in your net position that you see down here. So overall, had an increase in net position of $738,000. And the last fund we have here is your liquor fund. Comparing 2018 to 2019, again, for your liquor fund, revenues were almost exactly the same, a little over $1,000 difference there. Operating expenses increased by about $19,000. And I was looking into the details of what changed here, and it looked like about $9,000 of that increase was due to some salaries or compensation type expenses. But actually $10,000 of that increase in expenses is related to PARA, the GASB 68 pension calculations that we do each year to put that pension liability on your books. Well, your proportionate share of the liability went up a little bit this year, and we'll talk about that on one of the future slides here. But because your share of the liability went up, statewide plan, you had your share of that liability, you had to recognize an expense. That expense came out to about $10,000, and that accounts for the majority of this increase. So overall, even with that, you had operating income of about $29,000. Non-operating items here, investment income, about $20,000. And then you had your transfer out to the general fund of about $37,500. And after that transfer out, you had a remaining increase in your net position of about $11,000. Okay, so real briefly, another cash trend analysis for each one of these funds. Looking at your sewer fund here, this big spike you see here, this is related to the debt that you issued as well as the grant proceeds that you received for your AMPI project. So you had some cash on hand at the end of the year that hadn't been spent yet. Similar to what we were seeing in your capital projects fund, I'll expect to see this probably drop off in 2020 as you finish the project and spend down cash. Water utility, slight increase there, and your liquor fund cash there was pretty flat. It's been pretty flat for many years. Okay, so that does it for all of your funds. The next couple slides, we just take a look at your government-wide, wrapping all of these funds together and putting them on the full accrual basis of accounting. We're recording things like capital assets, your infrastructure, your long-term debt. On the next slide, you'll see presenting it more like a business would in the for-profit realm. So we've broken out these into two separate slides here. This one's for your assets. The next slide will show your liabilities. Current assets, so things like cash, receivables, prepaids. Those short-term assets are in the blue, and your infrastructure, equipment, buildings, etc., that's in the red. So the increase that you see here in the current assets, that's mostly cash, and then assessments receivable to the city related to your projects that you started up in 2019. And that cash that's on hand because it hasn't been spent yet for those projects. And then the increase in your capital assets is, of course, those infrastructure assets that are being created by those projects. So overall, you had an increase in your assets of about $8.7 million from 2018. But going to the next page, of course, there's a corresponding increase in your liabilities. So I said the increase in your assets was about $8.7 million, while the increase in your liabilities is about $6.7 million. Now that's excluding the net pension liability. I tend to like to look at your finances with that pension liability excluded, just because it's not something you have any control over. But anyway, just like the last slide here, we've got your current liabilities in the blue, your non-current, so your debt, and other long-term liabilities in the red. This increase in your current liabilities, this is really just due to amounts due to contractors at year-end for construction-related payables, retainage, etc. And then, of course, the increase in your red is due to the debt that was issued for your 2019 improvement project, and then your AMPI debt as well. And then this final green bar, this is that net pension liability we talked about. So this is the city's proportionate share of the overall liability that was calculated for the statewide pension plans. So the overall liability is huge, it's billions. And based on your proportionate contributions to the plan during 2019, compared to all the other employers' contributions to the plan, you're assigned a proportionate share of that liability. So there's nothing you can do about this. The state basically assigns you this liability, and they make you put it on your books, and you couldn't even pay it off if you want. So that's why I always break it out into a different color here. Because it used to be something in the good old days that we simply had a disclosure in your financials. Now we have to actually record the balance. And one final slide here. This is your long-term debt over the past 5 years, broken out between governmental funds in the blue, so what's being financed by property taxes, special assessments, compared to your business type funds debt being financed by your utilities. So because of those projects, those debt issues that we already talked about, you had a bit of an increase in both of these categories. Any questions?
Anybody? Doesn't look like any questions. Like another fine job of explaining.
Sorry, Belinda, can you relay that for me?
Yeah, Jeff just said that nobody seems to have any questions. You did a great job of presenting.
Oh, great, thank you, appreciate it. Well, if you have any questions after the fact, here's my contact info. Feel free to reach out at any time and I'll maybe clarify something for you or whatever you need.
Okay.
Sounds wonderful.
All right.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Mm. Oh. Anything? Anybody? Break time. We're adjourned and we have 16 minutes till the next go around.